It is a important juncture for Iran domestically and internationally. This is several days into the withdrawal of the United States, of course, from the JCPOA, as it is called, nuclear deal, which was going to, or was poised to, end essentially many, many years of Iran's isolation in the world. It is a huge turning point for the Iranian government at this point. It's very unclear what all that will portend. We're here to talk about Rouhani 1 year in, and there are many, many aspects to that question. There's the economy, there's civil society, there's internal divisions within the political establishment, but the fate of the nuclear deal kind of hangs over all of that. So I think we will start with that, looking at possibly first, what is the prognosis for the fate of the nuclear deal remaining intact with some sort of negotiation between Europe and the Iranians, including Russia and China. And I will start with kind of asking Kasra to lay out kind of what all this portends for Iran and what the discussions were in Brussels. What kind of direction can you show us things are headed?
Yes. The meeting in Brussels on the day before yesterday was the first meeting that the Iranians had with the European leaders about how to save the nuclear deal. You probably know President Trump has pulled out of this, but other signatories to the deal, Russia, China, and Europeans, are staying in, and they want to stay in. But things are not as simple as that. Once the U.S. pulls out of that meeting, that agreement, then Americans are imposing what they call a secondary sanctions. Secondary sanctions means that any company, any non-American company that deals with Iran could come under American sanctions, i.e. those companies dealing with Iran cannot deal with the US. Obviously, big companies have big stakes in the US and they don't want to jeopardize that because they want to keep a relationship with Iran. But the Europeans are very angry. They are seeing this as an attempt by the US to push its power beyond its borders, extraterritorial sort of a push against other countries, including Europe. The Europeans are talking about the need for them to find a way of safeguarding their sovereignty. It's that serious. They're talking about sovereignty of Europe because otherwise the Americans can basically push Europeans and European countries around, as they are doing today with Iran. The meeting was basically a way of start of a process of discussions to find out how they can keep that going. The main thing for the Europeans is for Iran to stay in this deal. If Iran leaves the deal, then there's no point in trying to say Iran is central to this thing. The whole bargain of this deal was that Iran will give up much of its nuclear program in return for lifting of the sanctions, international sanctions. Those international sanctions were lifted after the agreement, including American sanctions, but now the Americans are bringing back those sanctions and bringing back secondary sanctions, i.e. everything. My impression from that meeting the day before yesterday was that the Europeans are angry. They are looking for ways of dealing with this, but they know full well that it's not going to be easy at all. There are no quick or even not quick answers. There are no answers for the moment. They were thinking of possibly sort of pushing smaller companies in Europe to do deals with Iran, the companies who do not have a bigger footprint, bigger involvement with America. But that's not going to work because once you start sending and receiving money back and forth between Iran and Europe, you're going to get into the American system of financial services and all that. So that is even that is not very plausible to do. So everyone is in a bind. I think for Iran is they probably know that this is going to be a choice between a rapid, possibly death or a slow death. Rapid death, I mean, because I say that because Iranians, some Iranian leaders have been talking about pulling out of the nuclear non-proliferation treaty as a response to President Trump, or pulling out of the nuclear deal. Both of them is going to lead to rapid death in a sense that once the Iranians do that, then even Europeans are not going to sit around. They're going to impose sanctions. They're going to come on Iran's head like a ton of bricks. A slow death is the way we are going. Iranians are saying that they are going to stay in the deal as long as they benefit from the deal, and they're not sure whether they are going to benefit from this. So we are at the beginning of a process of talks to see whether Europeans can continue to make sure that Iran benefits from this deal. Not at all sure that it's going to get anywhere. So, but nevertheless, we are at the beginning of that process. But at the end of the day, my own reading is that it's not going to work. Iran is going to be under massive pressure, economic pressure. It's going to cripple Iran's economy soon. We're talking about maybe in a couple of years' time. We have, a couple of years. Iran has some reserves and stuff, so they can survive. But beyond that, it's going to be very, very, very difficult.
Thank you. Well, you kind of ended that prognosis, slightly grim prognosis, but realistic, I think, by turning to the state of the economy. And maybe as we kind of do a big picture overview of these spheres, we can talk for a moment about the economy, because it is has recently faced currency crisis. Said, can I ask you to give us a kind of overview of where the Iranian economy stands, how important this currency crisis has been, what the price of oil will mean for Iran's calculations? Is Iran's economy really on the brink of collapse, as is kind of often described by many of the advocates in Washington who pushed for President Trump to come out of the JCPOA, kind of under the idea that this economy is imperiled, and if we pull out, then it will, due to social pressure and a slow decline, eventually perhaps weaken the regime and maybe lead to regime change. So, does that seem, wildly unrealistic? What is the economic prognosis, and how will it fit into these big picture questions of Iran? Should it stay in this deal, even if it's not getting any benefits out of it?
I think state of the economy is not very good. As we saw in end of December, protests started in Iran over economic grievances. And
the January protests.
Started in end of last year in December.
End of December.
And in a matter of days, it spread to as many as 80 cities. So much has been happening to Iran that it's easy to forget that just a few months ago we had this massive, unexpected protest. I remember someone who's been covering Iran for 10 years, it came as a big surprise to all of us, maybe primarily because a lot of people focusing on Iran are focusing on the middle classes, not the people of the lower classes. And the state of the economy, those protests showed, is in a very bad situation. The nuclear deal that was struck in 2015 improved the economic situation of the middle classes, but not the lower classes. That was a big disconnect. That was, I think, underplayed, underestimated, and that's why the protest that happened in January was a big surprise to everyone. It was the biggest protest in Iran since the revolution. I mean, in the sense of provincial nature of it, not necessarily in terms of numbers, because in 2009 when I was in Tehran, like, I don't know, 2 or 3 million people came out on that 25th of June. I remember I was in the streets of Tehran. So in terms of numbers, it was less, but in terms of provincial nature, it was definitely the biggest since the revolution. That tells you, I think, about how dire the situation is. But at the same time, Iran has been under sanctions for 40 years. It has found ways to survive. I do not think that I disagree with Castro on his prediction of 2 or 3 years, and I think Iran's economy is not on the brink of collapse. What I think the collapse of the nuclear deal will result in is that it empowers the hardliners in Iran, like before sanction, when Iran was under sanctions under Ahmadinejad, institutions close to the revolutionary guards, the hardline revolutionary guards, those people who are in the region in Syria and controls the regional behavior of Iran, were in charge of finding ways to circumvent sanctions. They had a lot of power. When Rouhani got elected, those powers were relatively curved. And now those institutions again are attacking Rouhani that he failed to bring any economic change under the deal, so they're going to have an upper hand. So I think it will result in hardliners strengthening their stronghold in Iran, but I don't think the economy will collapse because it's a big economy. And the collapse of the real, the national currency, is not an indicative of the state of the economy. So that's important to notice that Iran last year had 17 billion reserve in foreign currency. So it doesn't have there's a surplus in foreign currency. It doesn't have a lack of foreign currency. The problem it has is access to cash, dollars in the notes, because a lot of banks, it has a lot of money in foreign banks. Not all of them are prepared to give the money to Iran. There's no means to get access to these notes. So if you're in Iran as a private business now, if you want to get dollar at the government rate, which is much lower than the black market rate, you can access it. You can go to the bank and get it through the Hawala system, which is this LC system. But if you're a private Iranian, like an Iranian student who want to go abroad and need cash to university, then you have a big crisis. You can't take much cash in Iran. Now they've limited it to $5,000 that you can have it in cash. So it's important to notice that some of the headline-grabbing things, like the collapse of the Iranian currency, is not necessarily indicative of the economy in total. But of course, the problem with Iran is that the Iranians were promised more. In terms of the problem with Iran is there was a huge expectations about a nuclear deal, and Rouhani, as part of the president, and it was his main campaign slogan, has failed to deliver on that promise. But when I say failed, because he's the president, he actually succeeded in fulfilling his promise, which was securing the deal. Castro is quite neutral in his typical BBC analysis of what happens. And if I can be a journalist, if I want to give commentary and analysis to it, I think it is important to say that the deal is collapsing, not because Iran is violating the deal, it's collapsing because the other side, the US, is violating the deal. And I mean, he may agree, I mean, he can't probably say it, but I can say it. Iran, the IAEA has verified 10 times since 2015 that Iran has abided by its obligations. Iran has shipped out 98% of its enriched uranium. Iran has cut 2/3 of its centrifuges, has abided by all its obligations under the law, but it has not seen the economic benefits that Iranians were expecting. Things have improved, but not to the extent that it was promised, and that's the mismatch between the expectation and the reality is what driving all this disquiet, which is now topped by Trump's decision which means a green future.
I think that's a great point, the mismatch between the expectations, because, of course, the nuclear deal was negotiated such that Iran had to do essentially everything it promised up front, and the benefits that were meant to accrue were promised to come after. So it poured cement into its reactor, it shut down the centrifuges. Well, can I just, because you raised a really good point about the expectations, Rouhani campaigned on transforming people's quality of life through negotiating this deal and kind of bringing Iran in from the cold, and now that seems to have collapsed. Can I ask you, Charlotte, because you've been there recently, what are people's attitudes towards precisely that question? Who do they blame for this situation that the country finds itself in? Is it Rouhani and the state for its regional behavior? Do they kind of buy what is coming out of Washington saying, well, you might be abiding by the nuclear deal, but you're doing all these other terrible things, therefore, we're pulling out? Or do they hold, the government accountable? Who do they blame, and, what are people saying?
So I'd start by saying the mood in Tehran, well, the mood in Iran at the moment, it's pretty bleak. I think there are two parts to that. I think a lot of people who pinned a lot of hope on the JCPOA, they feel betrayed. They feel betrayed by Trump. They feel that this undermines their respectability, their credibility. Why can't the US honour a contract that was sanctioned by the UN? At the moment, everyone keeps their fingers crossed, apart from the hardliners who are jubilant, that the Europeans are trying to save this. But it does look likely that, yet again, this fits into the narrative of you can't rely on the international community to help. This is a narrative that the Islamic Republic has had all along. It has a fear of capitulating to the international community, therefore it must resist. It must isolate itself, it must be self-sufficient, and put the walls up. The deal was really a change in philosophy. It was the first time, really, that something like this had been achieved, where Iran accepted the interconnectivity of its future with the rest of the world. And so there's a huge amount of sadness that this has been allowed to happen. But what I will also say is that feeling of bleakness and of despair at the moment, it predates last Tuesday's announcement, and I would say it predates the uncertainty that has kind of been building as a consequence of Trump moving around Bolton, the nervousness that's increased. I mean, for as long as I've been in Iran, I arrived in Iran shortly after the deal was signed in 2015. Despite the sort of, the tangible sense of optimism about what the deal could bring, people are struggling to make a living. Rent in the major cities, particularly in Tehran, from my own experience, it's so expensive. I mean, wages can't keep up with inflation. I'll give you an example with the FX crisis at the moment. When I left Iran in December, I could buy 50,000 riyals with £1. 50,000. Last week, 2 weeks ago, I arrived, and we had all of the foreign currency shops are shut. You can't buy currency, you can't even buy it in the airport. So we went to some little market, and some guy's aunts, dogs, cousins, friend took us to a little shop, and we exchanged money in an envelope in the back room. I got 98,000 riyals for £1. That's double. If you think about the opportunities that completely destroys for young people to study abroad, young business, sort of small and medium enterprises to try and do their business. Even farmers, we've got a friend here who's in Kazakhstan with me last week. We were asking the people there, what do you think about this? They have no money. They can't afford to get married into their 30s now. They can't import the goods that they need. Is it still working, by the way?
It is
working.
And so, who do they blame for it?
Well, shall I just say something about currency while you fix that? It's the most exciting comment that's ever been uttered at the Frontline Club. Let me say something about currency. I think you will find, having just listened to the last 10 minutes, that interpretations and assessments of the Iranian economy are very contested, right? So I think that it's certainly true that there's a currency crisis at present, but currency crises are a feature of the Islamic Republic. They have happened with intermittent regularity since the Islamic Revolution. And they are very often reflective of factors that Said mentioned, very much a crisis of confidence, and kind of businessmen who typically bring their foreign reserves back into the country not doing that. I think also there is tremendous economic grievance. So Said mentioned about the protests, but at the same time, last year you had 6 million Iranians travel abroad for tourism, for leisure travel. That's a fairly significant number for a country of that size. And this is not even just the middle class. I mean, travel has become accessible to the lower middle class. You can, for a fairly manageable sum of money, have a tour to Anatolia and Turkey, or to go to Malaysia. So while it's a big country and there are many people who are squeezed, but at the same time, there's a very big middle class who didn't join into those protests, and there's, a lower middle class who has means to international travel. So I think that's all worth pointing out. But I do kind of want to push again for you to tell us, who do they blame for the demise of the nuclear deal? Because I think you're absolutely right. Iranians have been told for 40 years that the West is not trustworthy. They've consumed a steady diet of state propaganda telling them that, can't do deals. These countries are called by, euphemisms. We don't even refer to them. And they've steadily, I think, resisted believing that. But now things seem to have been turned on their head in that what's happened, is it perceived as an injustice that is really, were people cynical about the West? I mean, Iranians are, have historically been, in the context of the region, fairly disposed to the West. Who do they really blame? And, what will that mean? Cynicism about the West in Iran.
I mean, I think, as Said mentioned, the expectations of the deal were just blown out of all proportion. I mean, it really was heralded as the saviour. And a year ago, when Rouhani was re-elected, I mean, a lot of my friends were either working on his campaign, trying to persuade their friends who would otherwise not vote, like wanting to make a point of not voting. You must vote. Give him more time. He needs more time. Strengthen his hand. Give him a bigger mandate, and he can achieve something. And now this has happened. People blame him. People don't think he's a good communicator. People are disappointed, so disappointed by him. But I think, and it depends who you speak to. I mean, obviously, the hardliners take a huge amount of blame for sort of tying his hands. People see what the US is doing as a consequence of Trump, and they don't necessarily see it as the whole international community. This is one man on a mission to really destroy Obama's legacy. But I think in terms of people's blame, they're frustrated with Rouhani, but I really think people are hoping that he can now, over the next couple of years, withstand the storm of criticism that's going to be levelled at him on his personal mandate to deliver this. Because those who are of a more reformist or moderate mindset really hope that he is going to come through this, and maybe one day he could be supreme leader, because then everything will be great. If he falls away into insignificance, what is then going to happen? Is it going to be left to the hardliners? So I think people blame him, but I think people are still worried about what happens if he is removed from the system.
I appreciate your mentioning succession, because I think we will have to come back to that at some point, because that is the kind of looming other kind of consideration that politically matters. But you've mentioned the hardliners as tying the hands of every president, in recent memory. Because the hardliners are kind of cast as this spoiler, this kind of shadow in the system, and they're said to control the judiciary that is tasked with the fate of Nazanin, your wife. Could you speak, Richard, to this question of hardline control of the judiciary? Who are these hardliners? And if you could also update us through the kind of course of that about the current situation with Nazanin 2 years into her detention.
Good evening, everyone. I think that's right. I think it's actually a point that's been all along in our story, is that Nazanin was taken fairly early on in the nuclear deal. or been implemented, and she was one of a wave of people that were taken at that time. And it was always clear that there was a part of the Iranian regime that was quite keen to prevent, or was fearful of thawing relations, was fearful of what that would mean, was fearful of control. And, in conversations we used to have with the Foreign Office, not with the Iranian government directly, but it's clear there was always a fear that there are people trying to block and to prevent relations. And to echo what Charlotte said, actually, inside prisons, and Nazanin and her fellow prisoners in the women's ward, many of them voted for Rouhani and wanted to, because they're fearful as to how this could get worse if the other lot got in. And it is also clear, many of you may well know our story, but just in a nutshell, Nazanin went on holiday in March 2016, came back in April 2016, was stopped at the airport and was imprisoned. Was later on charged with secret charges that they were in the media about spreading propaganda against the regime, trying to overthrow the regime. Later on, sentenced to 5 years, and then after the process of appeal and so on, got nowhere. And then in the autumn of last year, we had a second court case, which was spreading propaganda against the regime. That's the process that in fact, this week again, we've had an opening. It looks like it's the second court case rather than the third court case, because the third time we're back in court, and we'll see next week. Our court process has been highly political at all points. So before we ever went to court, Nazanin was given very clear messages from her interrogators to say, listen, the British government made an agreement, should be out. Then when the day that the British embassy was upgraded to full ambassador status, Nazanin got sentenced. The day that Boris Johnson went to Iran, the second court case got dropped. The day he met Zarif, the second court case got revived. All along, there's been a sort of clear signalling that there's, Nazanin is a chess piece in her, and she's not the only one. Now, as a family, we've been quite public and been campaigning. Plenty of other families don't campaign so publicly, and it's not really worked for us. It's not really worked for them. It's not. In a sense, you go with your gut instincts as to what seems the right way of doing it, and it's hard to tell. Your question, what is really striking from our experience of the court process is obviously that it's very political, but also that even the sort of the scary side and sort of the digging around to try and create a fire and so on. She had a very traumatic trial with Judge Salavati where she wasn't allowed to speak and he sort of chanced her for a while and so on. But then he started to wait for orders as to whether to sentence her or not sentence her, and what to sentence her for. And there's in our experience of the judicial processes, it's highly ambiguous what's going on. It's highly ambiguous what might happen. I think probably since Christmas we must have done 12 applications for release. You sincerely promised, if you just put this application in, it'll help, and sometimes it looks like it's going to, sometimes it doesn't. And last week, she met with the judge in charge of the parole and said, listen, I'm really sorry, just nothing I can do. I've asked to release you, I've asked to review the case. I've looked at your file, there's nothing in your file. It's made up, it's a completely made up case. But every time the message comes back, no, British haven't paid the money, can't release her. And so it's as simple as that. And obviously within the system you will have those who perhaps will believe some of the stories about that she is a spy or whatever else, and you have some that don't believe at all. And then you'll have those that, in certain cases it's clear that there are people who joined the Islamic justice system for justice, for good people that want to, and it's heartbreaking that actually this is what it's become. And it's like any other bureaucratic system. It's got the full range of people who are really troubled, and then those who quite enjoy sort of making people suffer and so on. And I think there's a way in which there is a sort of real fear, even in our family. Pretty alienated with the Iranian government, it must be said. I'm obviously fairly vocal about it, but my in-laws as well. And my mother-in-law did not vote for Rouhani, thank you very much. He couldn't deliver her daughter out, but she wasn't going to give him her vote. My father-in-law did, because he didn't want the alternative. And so there's always that sort of disappointment and fear and sadness that the hopes of 2 years ago and the hopes of where we are now, but the fear, gosh, where could it go and how much, and these guys who were just, making it so much worse. And so it's I mean, yeah, certainly watching the announcement, which in some ways, some of the things, I mean, if hand on heart, some of the things that President Trump said I actually didn't mind. He did put on the table, listen, the hostages need to be released. Like, he said it, no one else would say it. Whereas there's a sort of a strange way in which, say, the British government is much more cautious about acknowledging quite what's going on because it wants to save the big picture. So it won't acknowledge the human side. All that said, yeah, goodness, it just looks so bleak and terrifying and could unravel in all sorts of ways.
Well, that kind of realpolitik that you described, that's kind of being conducted in a kind of opaque way internally, what do you think, Kessler, that this portends for Rouhani domestically? I mean, the kind of conventional wisdom is that he's very weakened by the American withdrawal from the JCPOA. Do you think that that's the case? Do you think that he has lost, basically his credibility, his inoculation against the hardliners? I mean, is there this, what is the state of that division that we seem to kind of always describe Iran as locked in from the outside, and, is he utterly weakened?
He is weakened, there's no doubt about that. The hardliners are in ascendancy already, we see it every day, and the judiciary and the other parts of the hardline sort of establishment, the Revolutionary Guards, and there's so many other centers of power. They are basically running a parallel foreign policy, in a sense, and they were hoping that now that Trump has done this, they can basically push Rouhani aside and take over many other centers of power, that some of the few centers of power that they don't control, including the government. So there were talk of hardliners basically taking over the government even just a week ago. But I'm not sure whether that is on the cards, in a sense that, okay, yes, they want to see the back of Rouhani, but Rouhani has his uses, in the sense that he has got a foot in the hardliners camp and a foot in the moderate camp, and when it comes to the crunch, Iran, given this present situation that it finds itself in, needs to make serious concessions if it wants to survive. Don't make no mistake about this. This is about survivability of this regime. They're talking about regime change, but Mr. Bolton and Mr. Trump. But really, the ultimate game is changing this regime if they can. If not, weaken it as much as possible. That's their game. So in Tehran, they know that. We're talking about survival of this very regime. And if the regime is going to survive, my reading is that they need somebody like Rouhani who will be willing to make the concessions that the hardliners cannot make. Hardliners wouldn't have been able to do it. They wouldn't want to do it. They actually put a cement in the heart of the reactor, one of the reactors they had in Tehran. They actually filled it with cement. The hardliners, if they did that, they wouldn't. Nobody would survive. Rouhani did because everyone knew that this concession they have to make if they were going to survive. And let me go back to the little bit of a history. We have been here before. There were sanctions in 2009, 2010, 2011, 2013, 12 and 13, and it got really bad just before Rouhani was elected in Iran as president for his first term. Then it wasn't just that the hardliners or the supreme leader wanted to make concessions. They had to make concessions if they were going to survive, because the economy was crippled. at that time. I'm surprised that you don't see it as a serious problem as I see it and they saw it, in a sense that they actually made these concessions that they would never have done it. They were thinking about how to rescue the regime. Today they're in the same place. Rouhani can be useful, and I think probably Rouhani will survive because he will be given the same task as rescuing the regime.
Can I ask you one thing? Because you mentioned a dual foreign policy, and there's a notion or a conventional wisdom that Iran's regional policy is run by the Revolutionary Guards or the hardliners. If you watch, Sunday morning talk shows in Washington, the regime change crew who's back in town, and the advocates say, well, we'll destabilize Iran from within, there will be regime change, and then there will be a new regime that will behave completely differently in the region. Is there really such a division between reformist, moderate, pragmatists, whatever you call the spectrum of the system, over Iran's regional policy? Because Iran, security perceptions are that it lives in a very dangerous neighborhood. It's permanently kind of playing political brinksmanship with Israel. Israel has sent over the Stuxnet virus before all this even happened to kind of, erode the nuclear program from within. There's been the assassination of Iranian scientists. Is there, and Iran is not admitted into any kind of regional security architecture, because especially since the election of President Trump, Washington has unambiguously wholly allied itself with Saudi Arabia and the UAE. So is there actually a big divide within the Iranian political establishment over this regional role? And if there was, the regime change dreamers, would there be an Iran that would suddenly, make peace with Israel and behave utterly differently in the region?
You asking me?
Yes.
The differences are serious, and we saw in the series of unrest that we witnessed late December in Iran. There were about sort of unrest in about 85 cities and towns across the country then, over a period of 10 days or so. And a lot of the slogans that were being shouted then was that we don't want Iran to spend money in Syria, we want Iran to spend the money on us in Iran. Economic pressure is huge, 25% youth unemployment, inflation out of control, as we've just had. Making ends meet is very difficult for Iranians. So Iran's regional role is extremely unpopular. It's not just unpopular, it's very unpopular. And the government of President Rouhani knows that. I haven't seen any evidence that he actually backs Iran's activities in Yemen or in Syria for that matter. And I don't think his government and his foreign minister, Mr. Zarif, have anything to do with that. In fact, that part of the policy, the regional policy, is given to the hardliners, to the Revolutionary Guards, to General Qasem Soleimani, the commander of Quds Force, and the Iranian leader, the supreme leader, basically leads that parallel activity in the region. The bottom line, the philosophy is we have to expand this Shiaism into that in a very serious way. And now today, by their presence in Syria, they have become de facto neighbors of Israel. And that is going to already causing quite a lot of tension, because they are on the same border now. 2,000, it's about 800 or 1,000 kilometers from the Iranian border. They are at the southern end of Syria, on the border with Israel, and that is going to cause trouble for some time to come if the Iranians don't pull out of
you had a clip that you wanted to show us, but I'm gonna, and if that's ready, I'm gonna perhaps quickly give us, to set that up, what that is. I mean, I wanted to have a chance to kind of within all of this hardliner, reformist, realpolitik Iran in the region to kind of look at Iran as a society as well. You know, a country of 80 million, very big middle class, fairly westernized, very modern. And how many people in this room have been to Iran? Oh wow, that is a rare audience. So you know that it's you know, quite different to any other part of the region, really. It's got a very educated, globally plugged in middle class, and it's had a struggling civil society over the last 10 years especially. Environmentalists, the women's movement have all kind of struggled to retain the space that they had carved out in the late 90s. So there's been a lot of arrests, kind of repression of activists, environmental activists.
Take one thing away from today, take this away. Iran has a catastrophic water crisis on its hands. I mean, this is a population of 80 million people, and it is running out of water so fast. I mean, there are lots of statistics bandied around, but the ones to remember, like, we're looking at 50% of Iran's provinces been uninhabitable in 15 years. 70% of its population, that's 50 million people, are going to have to move. This isn't something that's 100 years away. Like, I did my thesis research in Kerman and Sistan, Baluchistan, two eastern provinces. You already see demographic movements, people having to move because of environmental problems, water shortage. So this is a national security issue. This isn't just a bit of air pollution, that sort of thing. I mean, this is huge. To bring it back to civil society, I mean, when I was doing my thesis research, I was talking to farmers. And the farmers know these problems. I mean, the educated, elite farmers understand these problems all too well. And I ask them all the time, are there any grassroots organizations? Are you talking to people in other provinces, other farmers of your crop? And I mean, there's a little bit of know-how swapping. They have these outreach projects from the Ministry of Agriculture. But people are too scared to have any sort of political grouping that could be seen as a trade union or anything like that. So although there has been some improvements in civil society movements, actually, in terms of collective action and grassroots sort of consciousness, very, very little. I think the environment, very luckily, up until recent months, has actually had, it's had a bit of special dispensation to have a little bit of activism. And I mean, when I was there, I went to Iran's first climate change conference, and you had like a panel of like celebrities and documentary makers, like A-star actresses, etc., talking about these subjects for the first time. And central to all of this was an incredible academic who was based in Imperial for a very long time, Kaveh Mazani. And I stalked him into being my second supervisor for my thesis. He's just amazing. I mean, he's worked all over the world and tweets, and he was like the fresh face of Iran's environmental problems. And Rouhani got it. And last August, he was poached from Imperial to go over to the university, to the Department of the Environment, and take up the deputy sort of posting for the vice president. He couldn't hack it. He had so much bother from the hardlines, like personal attacks. He was taken in for questioning for 4 days back in February. He's now left. I mean, he was, I hope, many hope, the solution to Iran's environmental problems, because he got it. He wasn't just a bureaucrat, he actually got it. I mean, luckily he's kind of left Iran with his life. I mean, there are, I think, probably 7 environmental activists who are still in prison now. Very sadly, there was a 63-year-old conservationist, a very sort of, I don't know, well-respected man, Sayed Emami, who has for the last, I don't know, 20 years been a wildlife conservationist. He has a Canadian passport. He could have lived in Canada, but he decided to live in Iran. He was taken in for questioning and very sadly committed suicide in prison. We don't really know what happened there. I mean, it just sets a precedent, doesn't it? And I think the regime is starting to feel that experts, elite environmental experts, this could be the route by which foreign powers send in their spies. And so it's frightening. And I really don't know what the future of the environmental movement will be in Iran now, because people are scared to speak. I mean, I was there 2 weeks ago. By association with all these people, I mean, the acknowledgement page of my thesis is pretty much enough to, by association, get me into trouble. I don't know what the future is, and extrapolate from that on civil society as a whole, really, activism.
My question is, and I hope you'll understand, it may sound cynical, but it's to say, look, are we really taking the regime seriously and failing to put pressure, which I think the West could put on? It's this. At the end of his statement, Director General Lord Hall said, "This unacceptable persecution must end." What do you say to the argument that there isn't a hope in hell of that ending? Thank you.
I will just say one thing, and I think there's, in the land of Orwell, there's a moment to pause about language. You use the word regime. You use the word regime. Iran has elections, which is a rare thing in the Middle East, and people turn out for them in large numbers. Well, absolutely. No one is under any illusion that there is a very fettered process and that there are checks on it. But be that as it may, there's still competitive politics and people turn out. And I think we need to be mindful that we use these terms in a political way and that it just bears mentioning. I very rarely, as a journalist, hear the Saudi regime, a country that doesn't have any elections at all. So I will pass the question of, is there enough pressure and could there be more to you?
I mean, I'm clear, and I've been clear many times, I don't think enough pressure is put on by the British government. I think the British government is instinctively very softly, very reassuring that it's doing loads, and sort of the way Castro explained sort of the BBC's approach of writing a couple of letters and hoping that will solve it is kind of my experience of how the Foreign Office operates. They may be doing more behind closed doors. At this point, I'm quite cynical that they are doing as much as they could do. I think it's back to what we were saying before, that there's a calculation that the British government is making, which is that the top priority is to not destabilise Iran too much, not to destabilise the moderate regime too much. Therefore, we don't want to undermine President. We don't think this is President Rouhani's fault, the conversation I've been having behind closed doors are not that different from what is in public, which is, listen, we need to go build a good relationship, we need to be, but if we build a good relationship, then things will improve. Perfectly intellectually plausible. I'm not sure I buy it at this point. In terms of what pressure one could put, ultimately there'll be an interesting case study with the Americans in the way that sort of the American approaches, which is very aggressive, very clearly signalling we want to have our, There's a Congress has just passed a law. The Congress, the Hostage Taking Human Rights and Accountability Act, and that's just pretty straightforward. We'll see where that goes. The UK, to my knowledge, hasn't issued a démarche. It hasn't even complained ever about Nazanin being taken. Or I think with the BBC, so they've raised concerns, but no more than humanitarian concerns. So there's a tension there, but we'll see how it goes. I don't know what Castro thinks.
More pressure? Is there more pressure to be put?
I think pressure is always good. You cannot sit back and take it. The fact that they pushed so far is, I think, is the result of the fact that you haven't done much. For the moment, if you stand up to that and push back, they don't come forward anymore. And this is true in a sense with our colleagues and the persecution. Since we started this campaign in November, the cases of persecution has dropped. They have dropped quite dramatically. They haven't stopped accusing us of conspiracy against national security. The asset freeze is still there, and few of our friends have still been persecuted. But the cases have dropped dramatically. So it worked up to a point, but not quite fully yet.
I think BBC Persian is doing a very good job. I mean, I've watched it and I see the news on its website on a daily basis. I think they're very good journalists. I know a lot of them as friends. they're doing a very good job.
Massively popular too,
They're
right?
massively popular. One of the reasons they're targeted is because they have amazing, readership and viewership in Iran. And most of them are very Iran. They love their country and they are very patriots. They haven't seen their, like, I've not been back. I've not been home for 10 years. Most of them have not been back for longer than me. I think, but having said that, I mean, Iran loads the BBC because of the history, because of the Shah and what it perceives as bias dead. That doesn't exist now. Why Iran hates the BBC is because of its reach, and because it is doing a pretty good job of telling, like any organization, they have, like us and anywhere else, we have like flaws, and we might sometimes get things not right, but I think they're doing a good job. But that does not mean what you said. You're trying mixing everything together.
Yeah.
That made it impossible to correlate. I mean, the BBC person is doing a good job, but at the same time, there's a hypocrisy about Iran and human rights, of course. I mean, Iran has an appalling record on human rights. We saw Nazanin's case. I was the first one to cover Nazanin's case. I was the first one to put on the front page of The Guardian the harassment of the BBC Persian journalists. But at the same time, Iran is right about the hypocrisy of the West about human rights. You saw Mohammed bin Salman coming to the UK, the red carpet and everything. Not many mention of the human rights abuses in Saudi Arabia, while there's this focus on Iran. And sometimes human rights is used as a tool to put pressure on Iran. And that makes it more difficult for the governments here to have any leverage when it comes to Nazanin's case and other cases to have an impact. That's why pressure, no matter what pressure you're putting on Iran now, it's not working. Because after the nuclear deal, related to the nuclear deal, Iran abided by the deal, but even now there isn't a single UK bank that deals with Iran. The Iranian embassy in the UK doesn't have even a bank account. So when you're treating Iran in that way, in that unfair way, then of course maybe the moderate faction would not react badly, but the hardline faction would react in the ways that we are seeing. It's also the West's, I think, fault what we are seeing in the human rights in Iran as well. That's not often seen. When it comes to Trump, I mean, I said it on my Twitter that when I look back at the history of my country, every time the US has intervened on Iran in a major way, it has had catastrophic consequences. The 1953 coup against Mossadegh, 8-year war against Iran by Saddam Hussein, supported by the US, the UK, and France. What we are seeing now is, for me, the repeat of Khatami. When we had the reformists in power, Iran went through a massive change. I was the result of that. I became a journalist because I remember I've been here, but I lived most of my life in Iran. When I was seeing like in 20 quality newspapers on the stands every day. That's why I became interested in journalism. So, and then in 2003, Castro would remember there was a nuclear proposal, almost a nuclear deal. We were in the same position. Iran was not trusted then. That
became the axis of evil, right?
It was branded the axis of evil. Khatami got undermined. How hardliners reacted? There was the chain murders of like 80 intellectuals killed. Now they can't do that, but they are putting dual nationals in prison. Some sort of deja vu of how Khatami reformism got halted, and now the same is happening to Rouhani because he's doing the right thing. He abided by the law. He delivered on his promises, and now people are being punished for making the right decision. And at a time when succession is the big question, who will be named as the next supreme leader of Iran? If you undermine hardline moderates now, it makes hardliners in a better situation to take power when the time comes when the supreme leader dies.
So the bottom line isn't actually Iran. The bottom line is Israel.
Well, I didn't say any Israel.
Do you want to come back quickly on the BBC issue?
The double standards, of course, there's double standards there, and we raise that every time that the opportunity arises when the issue comes up. This is nothing secret. We know that. We have been there. We've seen it over the years. Israel is an issue in the region, a major issue, but so is Iran. On the question of actually us being biased, I don't think that's the case. Biased towards what? What we're doing, we are providing Iran with BBC standard of journalism in Persian. Yeah, you can roll up your eyes and stuff. BBC standard of journalism, I think, is pretty high. Wait a minute. I used to be working for the BBC, and I went for several years, and I worked for CNN, and then I came back to the BBC. But wait a minute. When I was at CNN, I was envious of the BBC. Whenever I heard my colleagues, my old colleagues in the BBC reporting, the quality of journalism, quality of their reporting is way above anything we have. Okay, you might not agree, you'll have higher standards, fine. But people in Iran, they don't have access to that thing. You probably know better than anybody else. Not many people in Iran speak English. They don't have access to BBC in English, BBC World, or CNN, or Al Jazeera in English, or anything of that sort. So they need something in Persian. We are the only people providing that kind of standard of journalism to Iranians. And that's the reason why we are facing this sort of problem. We are popular. We are probably, the last count, something like 13 million people watch us regularly. That's pretty big by any standards anywhere. We are providing information that the Iranian government is trying to prevent Iranian people have access to that information. That's the nub of the matter.
Iran has eradicated opium production and heroin production inside its country through 70 years of fighting it. To stop the heroin trafficking from Afghanistan currently, which is the main route to UK, it has lost about 1,000 people, and it spends about £1 billion a year in narcotics. 4 billion a year.
Accelerate
PPP.
you towards the question.
So the question is, so why is it that you guys don't mention this? You know, this as far as national security is concerned, when Merkel and Macron talk about it, man on the street, woman on the street being affected by it, the amount of interdiction by the Iranian narcotics agents is about the same amount as what comes into UK, and possibly twice. Never mentioned.
Question is, why don't we mention it, or another question?
Why don't you mention, why is it never talked about?
On the question of addiction, on drugs and stuff, every now and then, when the opportunity arises, when there is a peg, when there is an issue that we can discuss, of course we talk about it. What makes you think that we didn't do this?
I think there seems to be a frustration at the narrative, the mainstream narrative about Iran in the British media, in the Western media, as always the aggressor, perpetually, violent, the cause of all instability. I think my read of these questions is, frustration with a narrative that doesn't really leave a lot of room for nuance about a lot of really interesting activity about women starting campaigns about street harassment, or young people taking forward lots of initiatives. I think there's frustration that we don't really have time to talk about those things because we have to push back against the harassment and the all of these big picture realpolitik nuclear things. And I think Saeed spoke really kind of elegantly about how kind of internal civil society developments, positive things that Iran does. It's really interesting programs around AIDS prevention and showing drug use. These things really don't come into the picture. And a lot of developments are kind of constantly stymied by this constant, perpetual, conflict with the West. And of course, because the media is kind of at the center of portraying who the antagonists are and who are the victims, there is a lot of frustration.
Assuming if Rouhani goes, there will be the Revolutionary Guard will take over. Do we know about what the different factions, how much infighting there is inside what we would call the hardliners?
Thank you, hardliner and fighting. Thank you, that was so brief. A model for future questions.
I don't have a political question. It's just, could maybe someone, Charlotte, on the panel, tell us something about women in Iran? Tell us about what young women are doing, how they feel. Tell us something positive about young people.
Excellent. We like those questions. Moving back.
Thank you. Also, as a non-expert, I was just wondering what the role the young liberal youth can do to drive positive change in Iran in a quite autocratic society.
Thank you. And then let's do these two, and then we'll try and do them speedily.
Yeah, whether people, especially Saeed and Kasra, can comment on the idea. Maybe, what do you think about the idea that Iran trying to chase friendship with America, it's just a busted flush. They're not going to forgive things. Iran's economic and security future lies with China and the new Silk Road, One World, One Belt project, which Iran is at the center of, and they've got a political system that unfortunately is a bit closer to the Iranian one, and that is a model that Iran can follow and an ally that Iran can build with, and chasing friendship with America. They don't like us, they do like Israel, they'll never like us, they'll never forgive us, we should just forget it and turn, the country should turn towards its relationship with China rather than chasing something that's broken.
Accept that you're jilted forever. Got it, thank you. Yes?
Yes, I'd just like to ask, what does the panel think is the direction of travel for Iran? Is it getting more liberal, and is the civil society gradually winning, or is it gradually losing ground to the more authoritarian elements?
Thank you. Okay, so let's try and go through those. Maybe you can start with women. What is going on with women? What's positive? Activism, youth, liberal youth. Please say positive things.
So, I just want to say one thing at the start of this, which surprised me when I first got to Iran. You know that there were many bad things that happened after the Islamic Revolution, but one good thing about it was it really helped a lot of girls get into education. Like the whole compulsory hijab thing to start with did empower a lot of women from conservative families who wouldn't have normally got to go to school. They got to go to school. And so I know just as many female doctorate, postdocs, etc. as I do male. And actually, in the home, women are quite dominant. I think possibly in the obviously in politics, really underrepresented. But I think the sort of the liberal youth culture now, girls. I mean, civil society may not have a huge amount of political activism, but fashions change. Girls just the way that you wear your hijab, nobody tells you off in the street most of the time now. It's not that sense of punitive sort of control over how your body is. I probably have a slightly middle-class elite bias by virtue of who I was when I was in Iran, but I mean, there's lots of yoga now and lots of gyms and I don't know. I mean, there's lots of popular music concerts. I mean, when I first got there, I went to concerts and like, if you danced in your seat or your hijab pulled off, someone would like poke a green light on you to make you behave. Whereas now, you can kind of go and you can be a bit more loose. And I think, I don't know, I mean, and to come back to the other question, what way forward is going to be? I mean, there's always the snapback, there's always the risk that the pendulum is going to go back the other way. But I lived in Iran under Ahmadinejad for 3 months, and I got arrested for pulling my sleeves up. I mean, that is just, it just wouldn't happen now. So, a bit of optimism.
Very good. Pressure from below, creating some degree of shift. There was a question about China as the kind of natural, inevitable kind of ally or interlocutor, because the U.S. will just never kind of accommodate Iran with Israel in the picture. I don't know if you said that, but probably someone else did. So is the Silk Road, the China model is more similar anyway? Is China the inevitable point of contact with the world for Iran?
It is not. Kasab, do you want to say?
No, very briefly, I don't think there is the question of whether we want to be friendly with the US. They don't want to be friendly to the US. The US doesn't want to be friendly to these people in power in Iran. So that's out of the question. That remains. It leaves us with the question: where is Iran going to go? Are they going to go towards China, to Russia, replace have some kind of a, I don't know, a strategic sort of a relationship? They tried it before. They've been trying it for 30, 40 years. Hasn't worked because they don't trust the Chinese. Chinese don't trust the Iranians. Chinese are very selfish about their own interests. Which means that the Iranians can't really sort of trust them that much. The same with the Russians. Russians, even this last couple of weeks, 10 days since the Israeli attack on southern Syria, Russians seem to be changing their tunes and getting closer to the Europeans on this issue of having a larger agreement that will limit Iran's activities in Syria. So they're talking about that kind of thing already, a week after Trump's pulling out of the deal. So with friends like this, I don't think they can really
The Chinese
rely.
relationship is based on infrastructure and geography. That's not going to change, like political points of view.
Maybe not.
It's Iran, neither east nor west.
Exactly, in the middle of it.
Hardliner infighting, and to what extent do you want to tackle that, Richard? I mean, what is it?
As the expert, right?
You're the hardliner expert.
Gosh, I mean,
Does it seem like they're divided amongst themselves?
It feels like they're a fight. I mean, if I, probably in the sort of narrow confines of our story, clearly there have been different disputes between different factions of the Revolutionary Guards, pulling in different directions, and some of the best ways in which I've been able to, annoy the Iranian authorities, which is part of what we try and do with campaigning, has been to sort of point out that the Tehran branch has been rude about the Kerman branch, and that got great traction. In terms of moving things forward. So, there's not, I mean, it's one of the hard parts of our civil society. There's not a lot of trust and solidarity. It's really hard to build because of all the experiences people have had. It takes a really long time for people to want to put their head above the parapet, and that's true for hardliners, it's true for, so on a really narrow point, when all the stuff was happening in the autumn with Nazanin and she was always on the television, she was being taken to the hospital for various checks. The security guard who went with her was terrified of being recognised as being with her and giving over her name in case she got into trouble. They, well, you're the pretty guard, like you're the. So there's that sort of general fear that, gosh, this is a sort of, this could come on us. Which so, it's unstable. It pulls in different directions and so on. So, I mean, who knows where it goes? Except it's definitely, definitely changing.
Well, you, sir, at the front, brought up civil society on a global scale, but I wonder if we can just, maybe to end, because I know we're kind of over time, but can you say a few words about, you could also say some things about the liberal youth and women, and there's a Tehran book fair and arts and culture, and kind of life goes on, and it's very vibrant, and people are very engaged, and civil society, for all of its fractures, exists.
The four questions were quite interlinked. I would predict a bright future for Iran in the long term, maybe not in the short term, because of the youth population, because of the tech-savvy, young, well-educated. I say one of the biggest achievements of the Islamic Republic has been its education system, as you mentioned. Hugely educated population, and that's why they are coming back to get their rights, because now they know about it. That what probably the Islamic Republic didn't predict, that they're going to educate this population, but the consequences are now happening. I mean, when I look at Iran, it's the most America-friendly nation in the Middle East, the least anti-Semitic nation in the Middle East, the most connected internet-wise. I mean, 40 million Iranians, half of the population were just on Telegram app, which just got banned. Even my mom was joined Telegram. I don't think that my mom would ever use a social app to communicate with me. It happened. It shows the amazing desire, inside Iran for change. When you look at the Iranian young generation, they are much progressive than their fathers or mothers. That's something you can't say about Israeli youth. And that shows the potential, I think, in the Iran for a better, brighter future that I think it will ultimately happen. That's why I think they are being betrayed by the West. They feel that the credibility of the West is also being shattered by this huge betrayal, which is allowing the US to unilaterally bring this collapse to this amazing achievement, diplomatic achievement, triumph like it was.
Thank you. I think that knit together those four disparate but connected questions, as you said. And because I'm closing, I will just end with one little point from me, which is that in all this question of where's civil society going and where are the hardliners, I think there's a sense that it's completely disconnected, right? You have this political system and then you have society. But all of these hardliners that we talk about, they also have children, and a lot of them, the children of the state elite, bear much more resemblance to the liberal young people who are on the internet and engaged than any generation before them. So they're actually all the same society, and the pressure comes from not only the liberal, secular, northern Tehran youth, but the children of the system as well. And I think that over time will bring its own pressure. So thank you very much to all four of you, and to many, many great questions, and for all your patience for some hopefully exciting and productive back and forth. Thank you.